What's up, everyone? How's it going? Welcome back to another Demystifying Post-Production Motion Monday. My name is Elly, and I'm joined by two very special people, Chad and Dustin. Hey guys, how's it going?
What's
Hi,
up, Ellie and
happy Monday,
everybody? How you
everyone.
doing?
Happy
Yes, happy
Monday.
Labor
It feels
Day.
so good
That's
to be back. Oh
it's
yeah,
a
happy Labor
holiday.
Day.
Yeah,
Yes. Very cool, very cool. Yeah, it feels ages since I've been on like a live session with you guys. So it feels good to be
Same.
back.
it
I'm
is nice to have you
excited.
back.
Also, hey to everyone in the chat. We've got Charles, Jeff, Jay, James. Nice to see you all. Also, Jeff, I've seen you say about the link for the free t-shirt. I'll sort that out mid session. So yeah, don't worry. Ignore that link for now. We'll get that sorted. So, as you know, this is a brand new month. It's officially September. And with that comes a brand new demystifying topic, which is digital cinematography. So I'm going to hand over to Chad in a little bit once I've done my intro stuff. And he's going to talk to us about all the, the great goodness that we have coming up over the next few Mondays. If we head over to the Maxon.net events page, which is the page you can see right now, you can see all the great stuff that we have going on as a whole Maxon collective throughout this week. And it's a pretty big week. So not only do we have, as we see, demystifying post-production, we also have Ask the Trainer, which happens live on YouTube every second and fourth Thursday of the month. So you basically come and hang out with us training team, ask us questions on a variety of the Maxon tools, and we'll be there to hopefully answer those questions for you. And then, of course, on Fridays, we have the amazing VFX and Chill with Seth and Hashi. But also happening on, or kicking off on Friday, is IBC, which is this huge event. It's over 4 days. It's Friday to Monday in Amsterdam. And if we just sort of click over and have a look at that, you can see all the amazing artists that we have presenting throughout those 4 days, as well as some of the Maxon Training Team. So I'm actually going to be there. Jonas is going to be there. We've got Max, we've got Matt, and we've also got Tony Barry. So covering a wide range of the Maxon tools. And if we even head over to the main 3D Motion Show website, you can see exactly what everyone is covering, which artist is covering that topic, and some nice little sort of details about those particular presentations, so you can keep an eye out on the ones that interest you most. And that's going to be held on the Maxon VFX main YouTube website. As I said, it's a pretty big week at Maxon. So if I just sort of head over to here and just sort of click this button here, oh, look, we have something going on Wednesday. We have our full announcement product event on Wednesday, September 7th at 7 a.m. Pacific. And who knows, it might be some cool stuff. So, you don't want to miss it. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Also, don't forget all of the sessions that we do, all the sessions that we cover, we record and we put on our very own Maxon Training Team YouTube channel, which is this wonderful page here. Everything is timestamped and everything is also put into playlists relevant to the topics that we cover. So if you ever miss anything and you want to catch up, then you can. Or if you just want to learn something new, then definitely head over and learn something on there. Finally, if you head over to the handout section of GoToWebinar, you can find this page here. And I'm actually going to update this link. So basically, it's a link, and all you have to do is type in the password. It's a special merch store, a secret merch store with its very own password. And you get a free shirt, basically. All you have to do is pay for shipping. But as Jeff was saying, the link, I've put a little error in the link, so my bad. As you can tell, I'm a little bit out of practice from these sessions. So I'll make sure I update this during today's session, so you guys will be able to access that. And you also have the project files on there, the webinar recordings, which is our YouTube channel, and of course the wonderful events page, so you guys can catch up on all the amazing stuff that we're doing. So with all of that done, all of the intro stuff out the way, Chad, do you want to tell everyone what we're going to be covering throughout today and over this entire sort of series in September?
Absolutely. Can I steal my screen from you?
Absolutely.
Or steal the screen?
Steal away. It's your screen now.
Okay. How do I'm not.
I can send it to you if that's easier.
Yeah, please, if you don't mind. I don't think I set this up right.
Worry.
Oh yeah, I didn't set myself up.
Oh, your Maxon VFX. There we go.
There we go. I fixed it. There we go. Okay. Okay. Are you seeing? Yeah, you're seeing that. Okay. thank you, Elly, for the introduction, by the way, and thank you everybody for being here. Thank you,
My
Dustin, for
pleasure.
being here. I feel so much more like comforted having you both here with me to lend your insights and such.
We love
Um,
being here with you.
aw, shucks.
100%. All the
Thanks.
time.
Thanks, y'all. So cinematography is an important thing to me. I made this movie. This is my second movie that I ever made. Monday the 16th. It's about, Friday the 13th. There's like Jason Voorhees, and he's like a murderer and stuff. And so then I thought it wouldn't be funny if like, he did Friday the 13th and Saturday the 14th and Saturday the 15th. And then Monday the 16th, he was awoken with his like ex-wife and he has to like take care of the kids for a day. So that was like my second movie, and it's like really charming. I'm really proud of it. But like I knew nothing about cinematography. I knew nothing about like focal lengths of lenses. I knew nothing about like lighting or how to light stuff. And so there's like stuff like this where the lighting is just kind of like really flat and it's just kind of like whatever is there. And I really didn't know how to make this prettier. I knew that I wanted to be more beautiful, but I didn't know enough about like light or shaping light or using light or working with light on set or anything to really get it where I want. And there were a couple of shots that kind of turned out kind of fun, that were like stylized, and was like, oh, that's really cool. But I didn't understand like why that felt cool to me and why I liked it. So when I watch this movie, it's still like fun and charming, but it kind of it shows its 12-year-oldness, because I kind of cringed a little bit because it's not visually what I would have liked to have had. So part of this month is that we're going to talk about these basic concepts of cinematography, like how to light stuff, focal lengths of lenses, and like real world cinematography stuff. But we're also going to apply that to digital stuff. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. Also, a lot of this stuff from this month is going to be coming. I did a series of filmmaking courses for LinkedIn Learning, and I made a big short film for it and all this stuff. So it's like a 13 course series, and one of the courses is on cinematography. So a lot of these examples are from that. So there's more information in that course, wherever that is, about cinematography. So we're borrowing from examples from that. But this right here, this example I'm going to show you, this is kind of like what I want to do in this month in a nutshell. So I have this like footage here. This is Bitsy, my friend Bitsy. She's the model, and she's like just really lovely, just a wonderful human. And so, I look at this and my first reaction is like, it's really pretty. But as I sit with it a little bit, I realize that the background is lit similar in tone to her skin. And like, that's not good. We want to separate those things usually and make her pop a little bit. And so what we did, if we look here at the, well, it's taking a second for my hard drive to wake up. Forgive me for this. I got these on an external hard drive because there's a lot of big files. So this is actually what's going on behind the scenes. So we have a backlight on her. We have a key light on her coming from this direction. I'll explain what all that stuff is if you're not familiar in just a second. And then what we did is that we brought in a flag. And that's what this like black square thing is, brought in a flag. And what we did is, this is me kind of like what we call auditioning a flag. So I'm kind of like just holding it and walking around with it, trying to see like where I want to block the light and what looks good. So then I point authoritatively, and then we get a C-stand as my buddy Elijah, and trusty Elijah sets up the flag on a C-stand, and then we're able to block that light from the background. And then this is the before, and then this is the after. So before and after. And that's what this month is for me in a nutshell, because when I'm working in Cinema 4D or Redshift, I think like this. I think like, okay, like, is my light spilling onto the background, or do I need to flag it some way? And I approach things from this kind of background of working on set, and I don't have to deal with like C-stands and all this garbage. I could just kind of like block it in other ways, but I still think like that. But I know a lot of us start out in After Effects or Cinema 4D or Redshift or whatever 3D app. And so that's our background. We're used to digital tools, and we're not used to thinking the way that we do on set. So half of this month is about talking about cinematography and focal length and light placement and all that kind of stuff. And half of it is getting us that are familiar with digital tools understanding real world tools and what we can learn about the process of digital cinematography from practical cinematography. So there's that. And over the course of this thing, we're going to talk about making a beautiful shot. So we're not going to go over this today per se, but this is the kind of stuff that that we're going to be doing. So like this is one of my favorite tutorials I've ever made in my life. So we had somebody, and this speaks to the Monday the 16th Chad, that had no idea what to do. Like I have this shot and it just didn't look good and I had no idea what to do from that point. And so we'll go through this month, this shot, and be able to take a shot like this and then gradually, with like no budget and no effort and nothing, just kind of turn this into something like that's pretty gorgeous. And so we'll go through like the whole process of evaluating the shot and what doesn't look right and what's working, and then step by step all the things that we did to make it more beautiful, to increase the lighting, to increase the production design, to increase everything about it, that to make it more beautiful, all those steps. So that's kind of what this is about, taking, and this works like all the techniques that we use to go from this to this, you can apply in Redshift or Cinema or After Effects or whatever. The concepts are still the same. So feel free to interject with like questions, comments, yada, yada, whatever. It seems like this is like a big formal presentation, so I'm kind of like hesitant and self-conscious about it, but interrupt at any point all the time. Okay, so
also, just, I love to like butt in. So James was saying he absolutely loves the title Monday the 16th, by the way. So I just thought I'd interject with that. And we had a question from Jay about gobos, but this might be more of a kind of like later on potential question with Dustin.
Sweet. We are going to be talking, so this week is going to be just kind of like, I probably should introduce this week as well. This week is just going to be kind of like a general overview of just cinematography basics. And we're going to talk with Dustin in a little bit about kind of how these things work in like the digital world as well. But we're just going to be talking about like a lot of basics: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. We're going to be talking about hard light, soft light, and just some basic things like that this week, just to kind of set everything else up. And then next week, we're going to be talking about much more detail about lighting. And then week 3, we're going to be talking about working with the aperture, like more detailed stuff about the aperture, bokeh, and depth of field, and lens flares, and things like that. And then week 4, finally, we're going to be talking about telling stories with cameras. So we're going to be talking a lot about focal length. A lot of people that start out in the digital world, they have the focal length sliders, and it just seems like it's how much you're zooming in and out, but that's not the case at all, because focal length does a lot more than just zoom in and out, and it's a really powerful storytelling tool, and we'll talk about why that is and show examples of that and all that kind of stuff in week 4, more advanced camera stuff, basically. So, so if we don't get to gobos, cookie lorises, all that kind of stuff this week, then we'll talk about it next week. So just so we're on the same page, we're going to start with basic stuff, but we're going to get more advanced. So even if you've heard of like, 3-point lighting or hard light, soft light, or exposure triangle, stick with us, because on each of these things, we're going to be getting a little bit more deep. So we have 3 ways to control exposure in the camera: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And these are basically like features on almost every single camera, and even something like an iPhone, that these things are not discoverable. You can hack into them and control them, because it's like every camera in the world uses these 3 things to adjust exposure. In other words, when we say exposure, we mean like the light coming into the camera. And so when we use aperture, shutter speed, and ISO together, we call this like the exposure triangle. Some people call it the exposure triangle, because they're just 3 different ways to, control light. But the thing is about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO is that there are side effects for each of these. There are consequences, we could say, for adjusting the aperture, or the brightness of the image, how much light's coming in with the aperture. There's a side effect. If you want to use the shutter speed to control the exposure, there's an after effect. If you want to use the ISO, there's also, there's a trade-off, there's a consequence. And so we need to be aware of that. So let's talk about aperture, ISO, and shutter speed for just a second. So first of all, we have the aperture, and this is a component in the lens made up of a series of what we call blades, these little sharp things, and they open and close to let out light or let in light and keep out light. So if I take the aperture and I shrink it down, then it lets less light in, so it darkens things. And again, I get that this is very basic, but it's important to understand some of these components as we get deeper. It's going to make more of a foundation there. So again, closing the aperture lets out or keeps light out. Opening it lets more light in, which is really important. Is that a question? No. Okay. So the first trade-off here, when we adjust our exposure using the aperture, so when we open it and close it, the side effect is that it affects our depth of field. It affects what's in focus. So if I close my aperture all the way or a lot, then I can get a shot like this, like I'm at the Grand Canyon. It's very vast. It's a Grand Canyon. And so then as I stop down, or in other words, close the aperture, then we're going to get more stuff in focus. And so that's great if I'm at the Grand Canyon and I'm outdoors and I want to get all that stuff. But if I open up the aperture and then get light, it shrinks the depth of field. So here I have these spheres. And then as I open up the aperture, the depth of field, which again, the depth of field is the area in focus, the depth of field is going to shrink and we're going to get a shallower depth of field like this. So only this sphere is in focus, which is a function of opening up the aperture. It's a side effect of opening up the aperture. Sometimes it's a side effect that we really want. So it allows us to get shots like this, where like, I mean, if you look at this, I mean, these hairs, these particular hairs are in focus, but even her eye is out of focus, and even her ear right behind that is out of focus as well. So opening up the aperture allows us to get that, but we lose that depth of field if that's what we're going for. So something to be aware of. Here's another like example here. So this is f1.4. So this is what we call wide open for that lens. The aperture is as wide open as it can get, letting in all the light. And so you see like the plants right here, right behind the subjects, are out of focus. And then as we switch to another shot here, this is f14. So for a reason that I'll explain later this month, there's like an interesting science thing going on there with the f-stops, with how we measure the aperture. So 1.4 is actually really open, and then f14 is actually really closed. So the higher the number goes, the more that the aperture is closed. And so when we have an f14, the aperture is actually more closed, and then you can see that we have more stuff in focus here. So again, f4 is, or f1.4 is, we have a shallow depth of field, stuff's out of focus. And f14, we have much more stuff in focus. We can go back really, really far there. And then also another thing to point out is that when you're going lens shopping, you'll often see an f-stop listed in the listing of, or the information of a lens. And what that's telling you is the widest it's able to go. So like some lenses, they can only open up to like f5.6, which is not that wide. So you're not going to be able to get this level of shallow depth of field typically with that type of lens. It doesn't open that wide. And so it's good to pay attention to that value so you know how wide open that lens can get. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about shutter speed. Is there a question? Nope, I'm just getting echo.
Yeah, no, I think we're good. A few people, actually, there was one from Jay. Do you have preferred shooting mode, i.e. aperture priority?
I don't. So that's a feature of like Canon cameras. That's not like typical on, from my experience, of like Arri Alexa or a Red or whatever. It's not like a typical thing. But Canon cameras, they have options where like it will automatically adjust the aperture for you, or automatically adjust the shutter speed for you, or whatever. But when I'm on a Canon camera, I prefer to work like full manual. like I get nervous when something is in control of one of those things for me. I like them to be set exactly where they are and be fully aware of those three things. So that's like how I like to shoot. But Dustin, do you have a preference? Do you use aperture priority? You do more stills photography.
Yeah, I do quite a bit more in the way of stills. Um, I shoot manual. I don't really like the camera to decide what I'm using. So, um, yeah, that's pretty much my answer. Shoot manual all the time.
Yeah. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with, shooting aperture priority or whatever else you're into. But
No, and it's not always right. So there are times where I've been on a photo set and I'm shooting, and all of a sudden with the mirrorless cameras that I'm using, so I use the Canon R and the R5, and on our lens we have like this control ring, and every now and then I'll accidentally like half press the shutter button and go to zoom whatever with my variable zoom lens, and it adjusts my ISO to like 16,000. And I've been in spots where that's happened, and it's been like super intense and it's crazy. And then I have to like quickly on the fly figure out why I'm like insanely overexposed. Um, yeah, and sometimes it's like, okay, I crank my shutter speed up to like 4,000 and I just roll with it and denoise in post. Shameless. I'm so shameless about it. but there's not really always a right way to do things or an easy way to do things. It's more when I'm shooting manual, I just don't like the camera specifically to say, hey, I'm going to bump my ISO up to 4,000, and that's because you're using like XYZ in like this metering space. But are we talking
Yeah.
about metering?
We're not. We wasn't planned on talking about it today, but yeah, as we talk about
Okay.
like lighting next week, we'll talk about metering for
we'll
sure.
we'll talk about it next week then.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear your feedback about metering as well. So again, thank you for being here. I love hearing your feedback and
Yeah,
stuff like that, your preferences and stuff like that
fun.
too. So you mentioned shutter speed. Let's talk a little bit about what the shutter speed is. And for me, it helps to go back to film and old stuff. And I think Dustin, I think I'm getting some echo from your speakers.
Yeah, one moment. Let me
Okay.
here. I will mute my mic for a moment. I'm rendering in Redshift, so it's like glitchy a little bit on my side.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks, man. So I like to go back to like old like film cameras because understanding how they approached this exposure triangle business is like really illuminating for me. So in old film cameras, there is like this shutter, this like rotating thing inside that would rotate, and then as it passed through this little kind of hole, then it would expose the film. So the light would hit as this shutter was going through, and there was like this little notch. And the faster that the shutter speed went, the less exposure, the less light got on the lens. So you might say like, oh, well, just like open up the shutter as much as you want and or go really slow so it gets more light. But the thing is, as we talked about the trade-offs here, the shutter speed affects the motion blur. And this is also the case when you're in Adobe After Effects, for example. So again, this is where like knowing real world cinematography can really help your digital cinematography stuff. And a lot of times, if you're in a digital app, when you're adjusting the shutter speed, you're adjusting how much motion blur there is, whether you realize it or not. So that's actually how you adjust the motion blur, is through shutter speed options. So if I go to, like, if you're looking at like GoPro footage, like action cameras, one of the ways that they're able to dynamically respond to the environment and what makes them so good at action cameras is that they use the shutter speed to control the exposure. And so when you're in a bright sunny thing like this, what it does is it uses a much faster shutter speed in order to kind of get a proper exposure. It wants less light to come in, so it has a faster shutter speed. but that gives us some really unrealistic motion blur. So if I'm playing this, it's gonna be very shaky handheld footage as I'm walking on a sandy beach. But as we go like frame by frame here, there's like almost no motion blur. If this were set up properly, then we would have tons of motion blur as I'm walking. But this is very pristine footage, so much so that it just doesn't feel at all cinematic or have the motion blur that we're used to. So the typical way that the math equation that we use in order to calculate proper motion blur is that the speed, the denominator of the fraction of the shutter speed, should be double the frame rate. So if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, then we want the shutter speed to be 1/48th of a second for accurate motion blur. And if, okay, because 24 frames per second times 2 is 48. So we want the denominator of the shutter speed to be double the number of the frame rate. So if we're shooting 60 frames per second, you guessed it, we want this to be 120th of a second as a shutter speed. So this starts to affect high frame rate stuff. So if you're going to what we call overcrank on set, or if you're going to get slow motion footage, then you really need to be aware of your exposure. Like if you're in a night scene and it's really dark, trying to get slow-mo of a night scene is going to be very, very challenging, because in order to get accurate motion blur, then you have to really increase your shutter speed, which lowers your exposure. So it's something to be aware of there. Now, sometimes you might want to intentionally adjust your shutter speed in that way. So Gladiator, the movie Gladiator, famously adjusted its shutter speed to create more like gritty and realistic fight scenes, and then it was copied terribly for the next like 10 years. But as I go frame by frame on this, watch as Russell Crowe's like spinning away, we would expect there to be a lot more motion blur. Now, this isn't quite the GoPro footage. As you look at his knee, it's still kind of like blurry, but nothing like the blurs that we would normally expect from something like this. And that creates kind of like this like gritty, look and feel that feels like very kinetic and energized and intense, which you probably can't see over GoToWebinar. But imagine this being really intense with a tiger and all that business. Now, finally, let's talk about ISO. Here's a shot outside of a hotel room in Portland, and it was very dark at night, so I cranked up the ISO just to do some tests. And this is very indicative of the kind of stuff that happens with ISO as we go back to our little like devil's consequences for using ISO to adjust exposure. Oftentimes we get noise as we increase the ISO to let in more light. Basically, also I should explain that ISO refers to the camera's sensitivity to light, the sensor's sensitivity to light. And in the old film world, it refers to the film being how sensitive it is to light. So the more sensitive it is to light, the more grain and noise you're going to get. And the lower the ISO, the clearer the image is going to be, but also the less light is going to be coming in, the less sensitive to light it's going to be. But it's kind of more than that too. Like as we look at this, it's not just noisy, like the colors are kind of like desaturated and kind of shifted in an ugly way. And that's kind of the tough thing about ISO too, because, as we increase the ISO, it increases exposure, decreasing it decreases exposure. And then like the noise thing I talked about, but ISO values are relative. So, an f1.4 on a lens is going to be the same no matter what camera you use it on, stills, video, whatever, it's going to be the same. Same thing with like shutter speed. It's going to be pretty standardized. You're going to have a pretty standard amount of motion blur with shutter speed on any camera, your iPhone, whatever it is. But with ISO values are not really like absolute. Like 10,000 ISO doesn't necessarily mean anything except in the world of that one particular camera. Also, it's good to point out that many cameras have what they call a native ISO, an ISO that works really well for them. And Dustin, you could speak more to this than I can, but Canon used to have what multiples of like 320, I think it was like their native ISO. So you'd actually get, like if you went to like 640, for example, you would get less noise than if you were at 500, because that's like that sweet spot of the 640 is where it wants to live. Is that like
yeah, it's definitely a thing. To be honest, I don't pay a ton of attention to it. Personally, and this is, it's interesting as a photographer and also a post-production heavy artist. ISO is one of those things that I generally try to keep as low as possible. So in any given situation, like I may underexpose and then bring it to a correct exposure in post. I like to stay away from ISO, where just, as a whole, it's like digital gain, right? It's like getting your maybe audio and like your mic and everything calibrated before like getting it to your computer and processing it, because once you up that gain, it's just digital gain and you get bits of artifacting and so on. So for me, by all means, I try to keep my ISO as low as possible, unless I mess up and accidentally adjust my ring and it's like 16,000. But that's a whole different story. Mistakes are made often sometimes. So yeah, for me, it's, I think the lowest ISO that I can go to is like 50 on like a low setting, but I generally try to keep it at like, it's kind of like first line of 100. I feel like kind of dipping below, like if you go to like the low mode, it's like not really native, so it like introduces its own set of artifacts. So all things as you need them, and just knowing the balance and how to keep a decent balance for the type of work that you're doing is great. But if I was shooting video much more, like live action stuff, ISO is definitely needed. So, I'd probably dive in and learn a bit more about the science, like specific to my camera, because it does vary, from camera to camera and dynamic ranges and so many other things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and also you mentioned video being kind of a different animal, and what's interesting is like the two cameras I have are like I have an old red, and I also have a Blackmagic cinema camera, and both of those shoot RAW, and in both cases the ISO is just metadata, so there isn't like a really a need to fiddle with the ISO on set, because you could adjust it in post, so it's
Right.
even less of a factor when you're determining exposure. What I typically do, in case this is the question somebody has, when I'm kind of like judging exposure, like how do I balance this exposure triangle business? Basically, what I do is I think of the aperture, and I'm like, okay, what aperture do I need for the depth of the scene? Like, what is the scene calling for, and what do I want my like f-stop to be? So then I will get my aperture there. Shutter speed, I never fiddle with unless I'm doing high speed stuff, because it should just be whatever it is. Like that formula, it's just that's the way it is. And so I don't use that as a tool to adjust my exposure at all. And ISO, like Dustin just mentioned, I keep it as low as possible. Like I start at ISO 100, especially because if I'm shooting raw video, then it doesn't do me any good to bump up the ISO if I'm on set, because I could just do that later. So then what I'll
Right.
do, I'll have my f-stop in the right spot, I'll have my shutter speed in the right spot, I'll have my ISO as low as possible, and then what I do is adjust the lighting on set so that I get a good exposure with those settings if possible. Like that's the ideal situation. So that's what I strive for, if I can help it. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about the exposure triangle, like what can you do with that? So one of the things that's helpful is to have a fast external hard drive, so that when you're presenting, the files load quickly. That helps, not cinematography per se, but it helps life, and it helps when you're teaching a thing. So you can get silhouettes. So here's how to do a silhouette, and maybe this is like obvious to most people. It wasn't obvious to me. I'm a little bit slower than your average person. So we had Bitsy here, and this is how we get a silhouette. So we have, she was against this red background, and we just blasted that red background with light, and we didn't put any light on Bitsy. And so she's kind of hiding behind this flag here, but you could see some legs, you could see what that looks like. And so this is what it looked like in exposure. So it looks like she's on the surface of the sun. So there's actually no light on her, only spill, but this background behind her is actually red, and we're blasting the background only with light. And that's what those flags are for, to keep any light off of Bitsy. So then we can stop down. We can reduce the exposure with the aperture. And instead of getting a good exposure for Bitsy, we get a good exposure for the background. And you can see, I'm going to do this in camera in a second here. Here we go. So stopping down, stopping down. Speed that up a little bit, stopping down, stopping down, stopping down. And then I keep reducing the exposure. And then we have this really beautiful silhouette. And so we can create these like really, iconic looks from being able to expose for the background. And so we don't have to like key anything out. We have to worry about like that kind of business. We get like all these like fine details of her hair and like all that stuff because we're exposing for the background. It's just simple paper back there. So pretty interesting stuff we could do. All right, let's talk about 3-point lighting. This is something that, in every basic cinematography thing ever, there's always like, oh, here's 3-point lighting. But I feel like this is taught in not the right way, because people, when they're typically talking about 3-point lighting, and 99% of the tutorials I've seen, they teach it like it's a technique. It's a thing. It's like a technique. This is like how, like, this is where you put your lights. This is a technique. But it's not a technique. I think it's good to explain it in this way, but it's actually principles. It's a way to think about light. And I think that it's a really good idea when you're a digital cinematographer person and you're setting up lights in like, Redshift and Cinema and stuff like that, to understand 3-point lighting, because it helps us understand what purposes, what roles a light is filling. And so we'll get into that. Let's start with the basics, just so we're on the same page. So, we have our subject in pure blackness. We often like to start there, just start from scratch. And we add a main light source, and this is our key light, we call it. By the way, let me see if I could zoom in here. One of the things that you'll see constantly going through this thing is something called Rembrandt lighting. We call it Rembrandt lighting because he was just like famous for doing this. But when you light somebody with a key light and it's at like this really perfect angle, it's just like just the right angle coming like right. So usually like this kind of angle like this. Then it lights the nose in such a way and the opposite side of the face in such a way that it creates an inverted triangle underneath the eye. And it's just very flattering lighting. And so like as you're going on set, you try to get that Rembrandt lighting, because it just, again, because the light's coming from this direction, this side of the face is in shadow, and that creates that edge of the triangle, and then the nose shadow creates that thing. So Rembrandt lighting, very popular. Look for it as we go throughout the rest of this movie, or the rest of this session here. So our key light's our main light source. And then oftentimes, because this is, really strong on this side, it puts this area into like a lot of really dark shadow. So then we add a fill light. And that's usually like a softer light source. It's a little bit more gentle. We're just going to try to fill in some of those shadows. There's no rhyme or reason for the like intensity of the fill. It's only an artistic choice. Do we want tons of fill, or do we want just a little bit of fill? And then finally, what happens is, a lot of our character now is kind of receding into the background. We have, a dark background, and there are areas of our subject that are dark. And so we'll bring in a backlight. This is often called an edge light, a rim light, hair light, whatever. So we bring in like that light to kind of like light up the edges and kind of make our character stand out from the background. So let's see how this works in real life here. Oh, by the way, I'm going to be talking more about this, but you don't have to have everything. So here I have my model Lucy here, and there's just like a light bulb over her head. And when I got this scene, it's just one light. There's not even, it's just 1-point lighting. There's one thing. That's it. There's no fill, there's no backlight, there's nothing, just that one light. And this look, it's kind of creepy around her eyes, where like eyes are like hollow and black like that. But I think it's really cool. I think it makes her hair pop, and I think it's really gorgeous. So if I like this, there's no rule that says I can't just go with the 1-point light. And also the placement of the light, it's above her head. It's not in this like, any of these weird spots that we typically see with the 3-point lighting. So, but it's still a key light. It's above her head. It's a key light. It's our main light source. So again, it's not about the technique of like exactly where you put the lights, because especially if you're filming like a live action thing, or if you're doing motion graphics, then all this kind of techniques of like where you put the lights, like it doesn't hold up. So you can really put the key light anywhere you want. So here's Bitsy again, and here we have, let's see, I think we started, yeah. So here's the key light, and it's a little bit dark, and then we turn on the fill light and we fill in the shadow. So here's the key, and then the fill and the key. And one of the things that this does is that it creates less contrast. So if we're making a kids movie like the Muppets, I mean, this is kind of dark for a kids movie, this particular frame, even like the Jason Segel's like shadows here, a little bit dark. But as we have less contrast between the brightest parts of our image, and you can see like there's a key coming in this direction, we have fill coming in this direction, and as we lighten this up, we have less contrast, and that creates a more just kind of soft, gentle image, as opposed to like Silence of the Lambs, where you're going to have a stronger contrast. I mean, look at like this area of her cheek compared to this area of her hair. And one of the things I'll mention very briefly that's good to point out is that, you know, all these things are intentional and they are artistically done. So in the world of the Muppets, you know, we don't have really, really deep shadows, because in the world of the Muppets, like everything's light. So when there's evil and darkness, the darkness isn't that dark. But if you're going to, you know, Hannibal Lecter, you know, the darkness gets really, really dark. And the contrast between, you know, Agent Starling and Buffalo Bill is as strong as the contrast between her cheek and her hair. So we have dramatic purposes for using light and shadow and contrast the way that we do. So again, we might not have any fill in these areas. We might not want any fill intentionally because we might want darkness and shadow for storytelling purposes. Another thing that happens when we stagger lights like this, when we have the key and the shadow and the backlight, is that we're creating staggered sections of light and dark. So we have light here on the lit side of his face, we have a little bit of shadow, we have the backlight. So we're going from like light, dark, as we see here in I Walk with the Zombie, which is a really great movie, by the way. So then we have these staggered light, dark, light, dark, light. So we have just stacked on top of each other, right next to each other, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, and it creates this really beautiful, beautiful image. Here we see some 3-point lighting and Fellowship of the Ring. We have the key light coming from this side. You could look for like highlights to see where the key light is. And then again, we have the nose shadow creating the Rembrandt lighting. So we have the key over here, and then this is definitely not as dark as this background would indicate. So there's some fill coming from this side, and we have a really glaring hair light there. And then same thing here. We have the key, the fill, and also the hair light. And again, speaking to the artistry, you know, Frodo is like a much happier character, so he gets more fill. His face has just a little bit more brightness to it, and Bilbo's a little bit more of a shadow character, and the fill isn't as strong here, so he gets a little bit more darkness on his face, and I feel like that's probably intentional. So again, much less contrast and much more contrast in that fill. Another example here, Barry Lyndon, which is a great movie. Stanley Kubrick, who started his career as a photographer, so his movies are just absolutely gorgeous. And this movie, Barry Lyndon, if you're not familiar, he wanted to film everything with practical, actual lights that they would have. It's a period piece set in like the 1700s, 1800s, somewhere around there. And he wanted to light it with lights that would actually be in the scene. So it's lit by candlelight, it's lit by daylight. There are no lights that he used. He used no electricity for the lights, nothing like that. It's all just natural light. So it's a really gorgeous, gorgeous movie. So we could see here on our subject that we have a key light coming in, again, Rembrandt lighting. And then we also have a backlight coming from the same side, but there's no discernible fill. And so we have, again, 2 of the 3 points of lighting, and we don't have to have all 3. In this reverse shot of Barry Lyndon, there's just a key. There's no fill, there's no hair light, and so that's totally fine. You can use these as concepts, and again, not techniques, they're principles. So if you're lighting a scene, your motion graphic scene, you can use just a key light or just a fill or whatever. Another thing to point out, we'll talk about hard and soft light in a second, but if we wonder where gender norms come from, lighting even was gendered in the olden days, and you would always light women with soft light because we'd create these like soft shadows. We'll talk about soft light again in just a second. And then you would light men with hard lights. We create these masculine hard shadows. Look at all that gender shadowing going on. Very interesting stuff about lighting and the artistry behind lighting. And again, just very quickly, here's Bitsy with just the key and then the fill and then the backlight. But then we could also just have the backlight and then the fill. So we use like a little bounce card to bounce some of the backlight back onto her for a fill. So then we have, again, just the backlight and then a backlight with a little bit of fill. So again, those 2 points we could just use. You don't have to have like a key source. And then we have a key and then just a backlight, key and backlight, but no fill. And that's, acceptable as well. Another thing that's kind of interesting about lights, if you're doing a shot where you're changing the camera angle, then the role of the lights will change. So like what might have been a key light might become a backlight. And it's exactly what we see here in this Body Snatchers. So this is Bela Lugosi. So there's obviously like some key light coming here on his face, lit here, but no fill, no backlight, just that one light in the scene, 1 point lighting. And then as we do the reverse on Boris Karloff, we also have, we see that same key light, just that 1 point lighting. But then when we cut to the wide master shot, what was the light, the key light, now just becomes a backlight. So in the master shot, there is no key light, there is no fill light, because the key became the backlight because of the angle that we were using to film it. So pretty interesting stuff. Okay, let's talk a little bit about hard light and soft light. I found this like image on the internet that I think is really, really cool. Oh, also good break time. Is there questions or comments or anything?
So there was one that I think Dustin may have responded, but it might be a good one for everyone to kind of answer out loud from Mick. He's wondering, do you always put your ring light opposite to the key light or sometimes from the same side?
It's actually a really, really good question, Mick. Thank you. I had a section where I was going to talk about like what side I put the key light on. And I even had like examples and I was like, I'll just like skip this. But typically I like to put, if it's possible, sometimes with the backlight, it's not always, it's kind of like dictated by the space. Like we can't always put all the lights wherever we want them, depending on the size of the room that we're shooting in. But typically I like to have my hair light on the opposite side of the key because it creates, again, the light, dark, If I have my key light coming this way and my ring light coming this way, then I just have like light, lighter. But if I have it this way, then I have light, then I have shadow, and then I have edge light, so like more light. So we have that staggering, I walk with the zombie, like light, dark, staggering. So I typically like to put the backlight opposite the key light.
Yeah, so for me, it's actually funny because I set like my whole office right now, like my lighting situation is pretty much exactly what we're talking about. And there are totally times where I will start to turn things off, and I know everybody probably can't see me like my video too well. But once I turn off like my backlight on the background, this is basically a form of 3-point lighting. It's just slightly modified to where I don't have a fill light, which technically my fill light would be my computer monitor right now. Kind of Chad's screen in our questions box is like filling in my one side. But having your rim light on the same side. So if I turn my rim lights off, this is pretty much just a key light and the fill from my monitor. So if I turn on the same side, like it doesn't really do a whole lot until you turn another rim light on. And so once I turn the other rim on, I have like light, I have a very slight bit, and part of it's my skin, but it goes to dark, and then I have the highlights from the key light down to dark, and then my other rim light. And so I use this particularly to like remove, separate me from the background that I have, and then I introduce a little bit of light back there just for like the added detail and things of that nature. But it's really all the same principles that we're talking about today. So kind of quick tip in a small space, like you can still use this lighting and it makes sense. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Yeah, I think like probably when we talk about like lighting next week, a little bit more detail, we might talk a little bit about like lighting in tight spaces. Probably won't get too deep into it because we want to focus on digital cinematography, and like digital cinematography, you don't have to worry about like the tight spaces as much.
Yeah.
But that's like one of my biggest Achilles heel. I've been DP for a few films. DP short for director of photography. It's kind of like the person in charge of like all the visual aspects of a film, and usually the person's in charge of like the camera department on a smaller production. And my Achilles heel is when we want to shoot in tight spaces. And so I live outside Seattle, and when you live in a bigger city, like oftentimes the buildings are older and or they're smaller because they need to save on real estate. And so shooting in like a Seattle apartment or whatever is just like nightmare. So tight spaces, it's challenging to get the light that you want. So that's why it's good, I think, to understand a lot of these like principles and concepts, because oftentimes you have to really adapt, and you have to go into a situation that you've never seen before. But if you know these concepts, it allows you to be flexible and kind of maneuver and get what you need.
Definitely.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Well, discussion. That's great. So let's talk about hard light and soft light. Now, technically what happens with hard light is that when we have light coming from a given direction and the light rays are parallel, it creates what we call hard light. And hard light creates hard-edged shadows. But it's also important to note just the quality of light. Soft light is when we have light that bounces like all over the place. And a great example of this is, the expression in the film set, like God is the great cinematographer or something like that. Something about God and cinematography. I don't know. But basically, like if you have like sunlight, it's coming from like this one source. It's coming from like these rays. It's like, this big source, all light rays coming from the same thing. So if you have pure, like unadulterated, unfiltered sun, you're going to have really hard shadows. But when clouds go in front of the sun, that's still a very powerful light source. But now all of those sun rays are kind of like all wonky and, bouncing around in those clouds. And so then the shadows become much, much, much softer because the light's just kind of like going all over the place. So let's talk about hard light and soft light, because this is beautiful. So here's an example in the real world of a hard light. So then we get these like hard edge shadows, which can be not flattering. As you can see, I mean, her face is like so gorgeous, but like, this shadow, this hard edge that this creates is not very flattering or appealing, and it doesn't really match kind of like the vibe of like the background and everything else that's going on. So something to be aware of in that case. And well, let's keep talking. We'll come back to that. Here's an example from Bram Stoker's Dracula, where there's hard light and it can create these really powerful shadows. Also in film noir, which we'll look at more in just a second. Norma Desmond, before she asked for the close-up from Mr. DeMille. So we get these like really strong shadows on her skin, and the only way to get this is with hard light. So again, it's not super flattering, but it can create some pretty cool tricks. Here's my face. So another thing that hard light does is that it brings out blemishes and details. And this is, again, applies to you folks that are doing your Redshift and Cinema 4D stuff, because when you create shadows, like let's say I have, have these like acne scars or whatever, if we have hard light, then the little shadows in those little pockets is going to be harder as well. So it's not just like big shadows, but also little fine detail shadows are going to be stronger as well. So we're going to see those much more with hard light rather than soft light. So if you're doing like a grungy post-apocalyptic thing, or you have some kind of like rusty texture and you really want to show off, like consider using harder light rather than softer light to make all those details show up a little bit more, because all those little tiny, you know, crevices and creases are going to have harder shadows and stick out more. So how we would diffuse light on set. So here we're being, Bitsy's being lit by what we call a Fresnel light, and it's blasted on her there or whatever. And then we have this like diffusion, like a piece of silk. And so Elijah's going to raise that up, and that diffuses the light. So instead of having all the light pointed on her, now it has to go through this thing. It's like clouds, right? So it's going through this silk and it's breaking up. And now the light rays are like wonky and stuff, and it creates this different look. So let's look at that in camera. So here's Bitsy, and this is what it looks like. Oops, this is what it looks like with the key. And then as Elijah raises the silk, then we can see that light softening up. So let me zoom in here so we can see a little bit more closely what's going on. So here's the hard light, and then as the light, the diffusion comes up, notice the shadow on her eye, very, very hard edge shadow. And then as the diffusion goes up, it's much softer. It's still not super soft. It's not ridiculous soft, because we could still see kind of like a, you know, a very defined shadow, but it's much, much more soft. And it just feels a lot more elegant. Like this, I mean, the bright spots are not as bright. It's all just kind of softened and smooth. I mean, especially like this shadow, like right here on her face, is very like hard edged, and then it's just very, very soft and silky smooth. It has this beautiful look to it. Let's move on. In old timey movies, you know, King Solomon's Mines, they would have like, this is like that won the best cinematography Oscar in 1950, and a really cool movie, but very hard shadows. So she's sitting next to this like big round light. It should create these nice soft shadows on her. It does not. And they try to fake the light by, you know, having a light off camera here, but you can see those really hard edge shadows. And it's kind of like a dead giveaway that we're on a sound stage. You know, I really loved Gremlins, one of my favorite movies, fantastic film. But this always kills me at the end when they're going through the snow, because, you know, they have a very hard edge shadow going this way, a very hard edge shadow going that way. And it's usually a telltale sign that you're on a stage. Like, when have you ever had like a really hard shadow coming out from you going in two different directions? It doesn't happen unless you're like on a stage typically. So it's very obvious that we're not like out in the wilderness, that we're in a sound stage in Hollywood somewhere, and we have these like really hard edges. So something to be aware of. Now, it's I mentioned King Solomon's Mines and these hard edge shadows, and really what happened was in like, you know, the 60s and 70s, a lot of filmmakers wanted to create a more visceral experience, you know, your Martin Scorsese's and such. And so here we have like The Godfather, and you could see the lighting is so much more soft. It's so much more, look at that shadow. I mean, it's so diffused. It's like a totally different look. And here we have like softer shadows here. We have softer shadows here. We have softer shadows here. So all of these lights are just really diffused. And again, going back to the art of it all, it seems like, you know, when we are in the 1950s, you know, we have delineated, there's good guys and there's bad guys. But in, you know, the 70s, as we want to start telling more nuanced human stories, like the lines between good and evil are a little bit more blurry and human. We all have this kind of like dark side, and we're not all that amazing. There's not like good guys and bad guys. There's just people, and we have good and bad sides. And so that's kind of reflected in the diffusion of the light, where the line between dark and light is like really kind of vague and nebulous. So here's our Lucy here, and then here's like another piece of diffusion stuck between that light, and you could see that here diffusing things. And there's a before and after here. So here's the hard light, here's what's softened. So these streaks are softened. Another thing that's important to recognize is that, you know, when we have a little light bulb, and then we put this diffusion in front of the light, like this big diffusion now becomes the light source. The light source is bigger. And typically, as we make light sources bigger, then we soften the light. We have a softer light source, and that can come into play into digital stuff. Okay, and then we did a film noir thing with Bitsy and flagged it. We don't need to go into that, I guess. We can talk more about this next week. But I really wanted to talk about, Dustin, I wanted to ask you about some of this stuff and how it translates to digital stuff for you. because you have a really great understanding of, you know, photography, and you work on set, you light stuff on set, you diffuse lights presumably on set. And then I'm curious about how, like, when you're working in like Redshift and stuff like that, how do you do it? Because one of the frustrating things for me, still to this day, I don't understand, like, there isn't like a hardness or softness slider when you're dealing with digital lights. There isn't like, you know, especially if you're doing something like with After Effects, which has like more limited 3D tools, there are not a lot of options for like diffusing light, softening light, or changing the quality, we call it, of the light, which is like frustrating and confusing to me. I don't understand why that is. So could I also too, if you want to share your screen, I don't mind, you know, we could turn it over to you if you wanted to show some examples, but I'm curious about
Yeah,
what you
let
think.
me let me get this rendering a moment.
Okay.
So I can. This is what I was rendering earlier, and it kind of killed things. I think it made it weird and glitchy. So we'll see how we'll see how that works out today.
Hey, weird and
Yeah,
glitchy
if
stuff.
you want to throw this over, we can definitely
Okay.
have a quick conversation on this.
Okay. Let's throw it over to you. Did that go over to you? There
I
you go.
believe
Okay.
so.
Cool. I see your screen.
Okay, so yeah, we talked about 3-point lighting today a bit, and I have a very simple studio setup here. So I have a background light. This is pretty much what I have behind me or in my office, and how I light most of my photography sets when I'm going to conventions and I have to get really cool looks rapidly. And so it works out really well for me. So when it comes to light, you know, diffusing light, I have a key light, which is currently very flat. So I'll turn off my rims here a minute. So this is just my background light and the key light. I can actually turn off the background flood and we can look just at the key light. So it's interesting when you're talking about how hard and how soft a light is in Redshift, because doing this digitally, Chad, like, I totally get it. But many of the same rules still apply. So the larger a light source is, in, you know, the softer those shadows are going to be. But this is still very relative to the subject, you know. So the sun, for example, is super large. It's just a very long distance away from us. So when we stand out in the sun, we get very harsh shadows. So currently I have a 36-inch key light that's like blasting this subject in the face. Not really the coolest looking light. Now, generally speaking, with the way that I like to work, if we're talking, you know, Rembrandt or similar, it's like 45 degrees off the subject, and then I'll place my key light up a little bit, and then I kind of work there with camera angles. And you can see here that in the face, we're starting to get a little bit of that triangle. We could definitely push it a bit further. So in Redshift, we definitely have, if I go down in our attribute manager, we definitely have the spread slider. So this is pretty much a directionality slider, or what I would consider to be like a digital grid that we would place on the lights. And the cool part is that this is a slider. If I could actually show you guys my key light in my office, I have a grid on it. And what a grid does is it forces the light's direction, or the light coming from the key light here in like a single direction, and doesn't allow that light to spill out and be, you know, very soft. It doesn't allow for a very wide spread of that light.
So
And
that's basically
so
it hardens, right? Like a grid, like hardens the light, doesn't it? Because it's making it more directional.
because it makes it more directional, it's almost taking a little bit off of the scale of the light, if you will, because it's all coming in one direction. So we could probably talk about that at some point. Maybe we'll build like a digital grid. I didn't do that today, but maybe we could do that for next week or so on. Like build a digital grid and show this. So with our spread in our attribute manager here, if we take our spread down to 0, immediately, like, we're going to see hard shadows, because this is really not allowing that light to be diffused at all. It's not spreading any of those, you know, photons from the light source. It's just going straight down. So this is hands down the easiest way. This is one of the reasons why I fell in love with Redshift lights, is because this was, I literally had a slider for this, and I didn't have to work with a light source being larger or smaller and pulling it back and forth to be able to get similar results. So I'll use this sometimes to mimic a sunlight if I need to, and I'm able to just go ahead now and start to soften all of these shadows up. And, it's interesting because once you force, all of the rays of light in one direction, it's going to get a bit brighter. And so at this point, we are going to have to take our intensity and start to balance that down. The blessing of digital is we can do all of this stuff with sliders. We don't have to remember, a ton of different settings, but now I'm able to start to expose this in a way that's going to work for me. So if we, let's say, we'll just bring the spread all the way back up, just right click and reset to default. Let's take a look at what happens. We'll set our intensity to something like 20 for this light. And now
the maximum spread, Dustin?
What's that?
The maximum spread?
Yeah. I had to drag here to make sure. 1 is the maximum spread. It's like definitely a float value between there. So with this light now, it's a bit more what we can consider diffused. It has softer shadows. Now, if I bring this closer to my subject, there we go. Let this render a little bit. It's probably hating me at the moment. We can see that a lot of the shadows are very soft, and we've now taken the light, moved it a lot closer. Everything starts to get softer, and then because the light is closer to our subject, we're going to want to drop our intensity down quite a ways to start getting at least a little bit of a proper exposure in there. So with this light still being 36 inches, if I go ahead now and I move this quite a ways away from my subject, let's try not to go too crazy with it, something around there. Now we're going to see these shadows get a bit harder because we're using the same scale of the light and now just moving it much further away from our subject, having to increase the intensity. And then as we increase this intensity, it's going to mimic what would be much closer to, say, something like a sunlight. And so as we bring this up, maybe we'll just jump to 150 to cut it fairly quick. Now we can see that our shadows have gotten much harder around the face. And so as these things are happening as a photographer, when I'm on set, I have to take all of this into account because I can't just drag one slider and make rapid changes. So for me, if I want more directional lighting, that comes in the form, oftentimes with the lights that I'm using, it comes with a grid. So I have to, myself or my assistant, go up, put a grid on. I maybe have a couple different layers of diffusion, baffles and different things that I can place on the light. But when you're working fast, sometimes the easiest way is to just move your light closer. If I want softer shadows, move the light closer, kind of decrease the power a little bit, and then boom, I can take a shot. And then obviously I have post because I'm shooting a raw. I can really adjust the exposure a bit there. Now, that's kind of in my case how I do things really fast, because when I'm at a Comic-Con event and I'm shooting a lot of people, like you may only have like 2 minutes for an entire shot, so it's really interesting once we get to talk about things like flags and scrims. So we talked about scrims a little bit when Chad was talking about, diffusing light and placing, different layers of diffusion material in front of a light. It's something that, in Redshift specifically, I don't do very often when it comes to diffusion. I'll usually use a spread, or I'll adjust, the type of light that I'm using. I may do something like use a different texture on the light. I don't really have that set up, and I know that we're running quite, I think we're late. Are we late already? Oh, we ran over. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, so what you can do is you can basically take the texture of your light and plug a gradient into that texture. So something like a circular gradient, get nice, more feathered edges, and then you can start to adjust, the power of your light. It helps kind of trail things off the side of your light. And I think next week, Chad, maybe, are we talking about feathering at all? Feathering
We're
light?
going to be talking about light, yeah. So like all these things, like you mentioned scrims, but we didn't really introduce that. I have like a little video where I have like videos of scrims and stuff like that, and I also want to get more into asking you about like diffusing and blocking and bouncing in Redshift and like what you do and like all that kind of stuff. So this is a great teaser slash intro for next week's session where we're gonna talk about lighting.
Yeah.
We're also gonna be talking about like more artistic stuff about lighting too, because like I think a lot of people have questions about like where you place lights and why. I mean, obviously we have this Rembrandt lighting, but like, are there other angles that work? And when would you want to use Rembrandt lighting, and when would you not want to use Rembrandt lighting? The lighting that you've initially had where it was coming from like above, like that studio lighting, that's really gorgeous too. That's amazing. And when would you want to use that lighting versus Rembrandt lighting? And we're gonna talk about like lighting motivation and like all that kind of stuff. Let's see. Oh yeah, leading the eye. We're gonna get into some actual like painting and stuff like that. So lighting angles. We did some tests. We're gonna show you. We'll talk about inverse square law a little bit, all that kind of stuff. So we'll do like lighting next week. So we've kind of like laid the foundation for all the other more advanced stuff we're gonna be talking about the rest of this month. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited for that. I mean, we could go on for a whole nother 2 hours, and I know it's possible.
Yeah,
So,
it breaks my heart to cut you off because I love everything that you're saying. And when you're seeing it with like Redshift, it's like, it's one thing when you just kind of explain a concept, but then when you see it demonstrated like in a Hollywood movie, it's like, now I get it. And then when you see
yeah.
it with like, Redshift or cinema, when you're actually like building it in 3D, it's just like a whole nother level of understanding. So it kills me to be like, time, but
Yeah, I know. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I would implore everybody to like actually use some of this stuff in practice. Like everybody has a phone at this point, right? Like we should all have a camera, great quality, maybe lower quality. It doesn't really matter. Um, get out and take a look at this stuff. Like grab a pillowcase and put that in front of your window and like see what happens, to the types of shadows. When I started off with photography, like I didn't have a whole lot. Like I think I had like a floor lamp. I'll have to find photos. If I can find photos, this would be amazing. But like I had a floor lamp that I used. It was like super warm lighting, and I used to like do all kinds of different stuff with that. And then eventually kind of upgraded over time. But like the more that you learn these fundamentals and just the basics, and then you explore on your own, like you can do all kinds of crazy stuff very quickly. So
yeah. When I was first starting out, I couldn't afford, I didn't want to spend money. I didn't know if I would really dig it or not. So I went to like Home Depot and got work lights, which are really,
yes,
really, really cheap. And they're so powerful. Like they're meant to be like really ridiculously powerful. And they're also very, very hard light sources. So then that gives you
yeah,
opportunities to like really diffuse them and play with stuff. So then I got parchment paper used for baking. So it has a very high temperature. Like you can, it doesn't catch on fire. It's meant to be put in the oven. So then I would use
yeah.
that to diffuse my Home Depot work lights. But it was a great education, and you learn a lot that way. So
Oh my goodness, they are
yeah.
such good rim lights. We won't even go there. I may still use those once in a while.
Yeah.
Like, boom, it's on, it works, like
It's
covers the whole
it's a,
subject, everything's great. Like
yeah,
yep.
it's so fun. Okay, I guess we'll turn it back over to you, Ellie, to wrap us up. I don't know. I feel like I'm
Yeah, I
terrible
was
at
just gonna
wrapping
say
things up, so I'll just keep talking.
this was such an interesting sort of hour and 15, especially for me, like you said, as someone that doesn't necessarily have like a photography or cinematography background. And yeah, just sort of seeing this stuff in examples, like whether it's C4, like standard C4D or physical or Redshift, it's all translatable for any of these renderers. I think it's going to be a really exciting month. There's been some really lovely comments, and there was actually a quick comment from Walter saying, new to lighting and cinematography in general, just like me, what resources or books could you recommend to a newbie? And if you don't have any now, I thought that could be a really cool thing that maybe we could kick off next week with. Like I'm sure between the two of you, you have a variety of resources that you could share so people could learn even more.
That's a really great one. That's a very good question, Walter. I think one of the things that was really, really illuminating was what's the American Cinematographer? What's that magazine? the ASC. So like ASC is the American Society of Cinematographers, I think it's short for. And so like when you see like the DP credit in a movie, it'll say like whatever ASC, and it just means they're in the cinematographers union group, whatever. And then for England, it's like BSC for British Society of Cinematographers, whatever. Canada is like CSC, I think. And then they have a magazine, which I would imagine is all over the place, but it's American Cinematographer, I think, right? Somebody's going to be watching this right now being like, no, you idiot, it's actually called this. But they put out a magazine that is like meant for Hollywood cinematographers, and like they will show like the big hit movies that are coming out this month. They'll show the behind the scenes of how they lit stuff. And something about that gave me a lot of confidence, because they're using these same concepts. They're using the same like key, fill, backlight. And so you see, these movies that you idolize and these shots that you idolize, and then you see behind the scenes of how they set up the lights, and it's just like, it's exactly what just like on a bigger scale. Like that kind of thing is really informative. Maybe like I'll look up that magazine and give you a link next week.
Yeah, it's one of the best resources. Like I know it sounds cliche, but like practice, like get like the way that I would do this if I could start all over. And we talked about this a little bit in a series a while back when it was the challenge when I did the skull, and we were like lighting this zombie skull with like one light and a few bounce cards. Like practice with one light. Like you literally have lights around your house, you have lights in a window, you have lights out in the sunlight. Like practice with that, like rinse, repeat, and then remix. So with what we're doing today, like literally open up cinema, start with one light. You can move that around, do different things, add your fill light, maybe a rim light, and then start to remix that. So just rinse, repeat, same fundamentals, and then just remix where these lights are going. That's how I do what I do. So as far as like actual resources, Shotdeck, I think it's shotdeck.com, is one of my favorite, like inspirational when you're talking like cinematography, and I'm looking for looks that I like. I head to shotdeck.com, and you can see a lot of things about, various shots and films. You can see the color palettes. I don't know if we can share screens. Elly, are you looking up the site right now?
I'm not, but I can do.
Oh no, I don't. Am I still sharing my screen?
You're still sharing your screen, yeah.
Oh geez, okay, here we go.
I can take it from you if you like.
No, let's do this. You can take it here in a moment. Okay, so Shotdeck. So if we want to go and browse shots, we can definitely take a look. We'll just go to color for now. We'll say a cool palette. And so this is pretty much where I go for inspiration and kind of research and curiosity. So if I take a look at one of these shots, we have loads of information down at the bottom as far as like the camera gear that's used, the type of lighting that it is, lenses that were used, so on and so forth. And this will also give you like a really good idea of kind of what to explore next from some of your favorite films. So without running like way too crazy over, because I could get into this for hours, we'll stop that there. But
what a great resource, that's so
what's
cool.
that?
What a great resource, especially with like all the information. I mean, for me as well, I love like the color palette, because I'm trying to learn more about understanding color and like colors that like are aesthetically pleasing together. And so I always kind of like cheat and search up nice looking color palettes.
I also too, I recommend like when you can see that grid of images, it's really gorgeous. Like before you cheat and you see all the information about it, like look at it and study it and try to identify those 3-point lights. Like try to identify where the key is coming from. Is it a big source? Is it hard? Is it soft? Like the fill, the backlight. Try to like see what you can like test yourself and see like what you can guess from just looking at that before you see the answers, because that kind of like intentional analyzing of where light's coming from and the type and quality of light, that kind of stuff is very illuminating.
Definitely. Yeah, it's super fun. Rabbit hole.
Yeah. I'm
We
super
love
excited
them.
for the rest of this month.
Same here. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the next few weeks. So yeah, don't forget, next Monday, part 2, where the guys will be going through a bunch of amazing things. And then also don't forget this Wednesday, our wonderful product event for announcements, September 7th. Hint, hint.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yes.
Cool. Well, it's been a pleasure, guys. It's been so good to hang out with you and learn all of these amazing things that I can now put into practice and make nicer looking artwork. And thank you for everyone who's still with us live. Sorry we overran. You know, wouldn't be a training session without us overrunning, right? So have a great rest of your Mondays and have a lovely rest of your week, everyone. And we'll catch you next Monday.
Sounds
Thanks,
good.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
See you later.